I thought a police stop was just another annoying inconvenience until this cop decided to dig into my case like it was his personal treasure chest. Well, he opened it, and you know what? His face instantly turned bright red, not from embarrassment, but from the paint that hit him like a slap from karma. And when he finally realized who I was, his whole world flipped upside down. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, but Officer Jasper George wasn't in the mood to appreciate it. His patrol car cruised down Route 22, his eyes scanning the road like a hawk looking for its next meal. Jasper didn't have the best reputation in this department. Not that he cared. To him, enforcing the law wasn't just a job, it was a game where he made the rules. That's when he spotted it. A sleek black sedan moving at a steady speed. No traffic violations, no reckless driving, just a car minding its business. But for George, that was reason enough. "Let's see what this one's hiding," he muttered to himself, flipping on his sirens. The sound pierced Sumstad the quiet evening. As the sedan obediently pulled over to the shoulder, George swaggered over to the car, his boots crunching on the gravel. The driver's window rolled down smoothly, revealing a well-dressed black man, probably in his 50s. His crisp demeanor and the sharp creases in his uniform screamed discipline. George's lips curled into a smirk. "License and registration," George barked, leaning slightly into the car. He made a show of adjusting his belt, his hand resting on his holstered firearm for emphasis. The driver, calm and composed, handed over the documents without hesitation. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. George didn't like the tone. It wasn't submissive enough. "Problem?" George echoed mockingly. "I'll tell you what the problem is. You look like someone with something to hide. You think you can just cruise around like nothing's wrong? Not on my watch." The man raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, his face a mask of calm. That calmness only fueled George's irritation. "Step out of the vehicle," George ordered, motioning with his hand. "On what grounds?" the man asked, his voice still level, but tinged with a hint of incredulity. "Grounds? Let's just call it probable cause," George shot back, his smirk widening. He opened the driver's door himself, gesturing for the man to step out. Reluctantly, the driver obeyed, his movements deliberate and slow, as though he wanted to make it clear he had nothing to hide. George wasted no time. He began his inspection, rummaging through the car with all the subtlety of a tornado. Glove compartment, empty, console, neatly organized. Back seat, a single nondescript briefcase. "What's this?" George said, his voice dripping with mock suspicion. He yanked the case out of the car, holding it up like he'd just uncovered buried treasure. The driver's face darkened slightly, but his tone remained composed. "That's personal property. I strongly suggest you put it back." "Suggest?" George scoffed. "You don't get to suggest anything. I think I'll have a look." He set the case on the hood of the car, ignoring the man's protests. "Officer, that case contains sensitive materials. You really don't want to do this," the man said, his voice carrying a warning. George chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, I do. Trust me." His hands fiddled with the lock, ignoring the growing tension in the air. Finally, with a click, the case opened. And then it happened. A loud psh erupted from the case, and a jet of bright red paint sprayed out with surgical precision, coating George's face and uniform in one violent splash. It was as though someone had dumped a bucket of fire engine red paint over his head, his eyes, his nose, and his mouth. Everything was drenched. George stumbled back, flailing his arms and letting out a guttural yell. What is this?" The paint stung his skin and clouded his vision, making him stagger like a drunken fool. He tried wiping it off with his sleeve, but it only smeared further, adding to his humiliation. The driver, still standing by the car, finally let a small smirk break his stoic expression. "I warned you," he said simply. George's screams of frustration filled the air, blending with the distant sound of passing cars. His face was a mess of red streaks, his uniform a ruined masterpiece. Meanwhile, the driver crossed his arms, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. "That's a security measure," the man added, his tone almost conversational, to protect classified documents. George could barely hear him over his own yelling. "You're under arrest," he roared, though his voice cracked as he clawed at the sticky paint. The man didn't flinch. He didn't even move. "You might want to rethink that," he said, his smirk widening just enough to be noticeable. The scene had already attracted attention. Drivers slowed down to gawk at the officer flailing wildly on the side of the road, his face a ridiculous shade of red. Camera phones started recording, and George's nightmare had only just begun. The driver. He stood tall, calm as ever, waiting for what he clearly knew was coming next. George stumbled back, his face a chaotic mess of red paint dripping in uneven streaks. It clung to his uniform, smeared across his skin, and dripped onto his boots. The sticky, pungent mess made every attempt to wipe it off completely useless. His frustration boiled over. "What is this? Are you kidding me right now?" George's voice cracked as he clawed at his face, managing only to smear the paint further. The driver stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his posture relaxed. There was a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I warned you," he said simply. His tone is calm, even conversational. George spun around, glaring through a haze of smeared red. "You think this is funny? You've got no idea who you're messing with." "No, officer," the man replied, tilting his head slightly. "I'm pretty sure it's you who has no idea." The casual confidence in the man's voice lit a new fire under George. He stumbled toward the man, pointing an accusatory finger. "You're under arrest for what, exactly?" The driver cut in, his voice steady but firm. "For having my personal property tampered with? For following your illegal commands? Go ahead, I'd love to hear the charges." For a moment, George froze, his fury clashing with the growing realization that this man wasn't the easy target he had assumed. Cars began to slow on the highway, a few drivers rolling down their windows or holding up their phones to record the ridiculous sight of a paint-drenched cop flailing on the side of the road. "Yo, that cop just got wrecked," a voice called from a passing car. Another honked in mock applause. The driver turned slightly, giving a polite nod to the onlookers before returning his attention to George. "Might want to wrap this up, officer. You're drawing a crowd." George fumbled for his radio, desperate to salvage some shred of authority. "I need backup," officer assaulted. "Repeat, suspect armed with..." He glanced at the paint dripping off his chin. "Some kind of hazardous device." The man let out a short, dry laugh. "Hazardous? That's one way to describe a paint canister designed to protect classified documents." George whipped around, glaring at the man, who remained infuriatingly calm. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he shouted, his voice shaking with rage. "And yet, here I am," the driver replied smoothly, taking a measured step forward. "By the way, you might want to know who you're dealing with before you make things worse." George hesitated, his chest heaving as he tried to process the unexpected shift in tone. The man's polished demeanor suddenly carried an air of authority that George couldn't ignore. "Who the hell do you think you are?" George finally spat, though his voice wavered. The man adjusted his jacket, revealing the insignia on his sleeve. "Connor Edward, Vice Admiral, United States Navy. Retired." The words hung in the air, each one landing like a hammer blow. George froze, his red-smeared face a mix of shock and disbelief. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Before he could recover, the distant wail of sirens pierced the tension. Backup had arrived, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. The tables had turned, and George's position of power was slipping fast. The sound of sirens cut through the tension as two patrol cars screeched to a halt. Backup had arrived. Officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the scene, quickly landing on the disheveled figure of Officer George, drenched in red paint from head to toe. He looked like a mascot for a bad art show. Across from him, Vice Admiral Connor Edward stood tall, arms crossed, his face calm as though nothing unusual had happened. Sergeant Louis, a seasoned officer with no patience for nonsense, was the first to speak. "What's going on here?" His tone was sharp, laced with disbelief, as he took in the sight of George flailing and wiping at his face, smearing the paint even more. George pointed a trembling finger at Edward. "This man assaulted me. He used some kind of chemical weapon. It's dangerous. I need immediate backup." Edward raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable but distinctly unimpressed. "Sergeant," he began. His tone was measured and authoritative. "I'm Vice Admiral Connor Edward, United States Navy, retired. What your officer is calling a chemical weapon is, in fact, a harmless security measure. He ignored multiple warnings and triggered the device by tampering with my personal property." Lewis blinked, the weight of Edward's words sinking in. "You're military?" he asked, his voice lower, more cautious now. "Retired," Edward confirmed. "And while I respect law enforcement, I cannot overlook blatant misconduct." Louis turned to George, his jaw tightening. "George, tell me this isn't what it looks like." "It's not my fault," George blurted, his voice rising. "That briefcase looks suspicious, and he refused to cooperate. I was just doing my job." "Doing your job?" Edward cut in, his voice calm, but with a sharp edge. "Your job involves ignoring protests and violating someone's rights?" Louis glared at George. "You conducted an unauthorized search?" The question was more of an accusation, and George's silence said it all. The other officers exchanged glances, some struggling to suppress smirks at the absurdity of the situation. One of them whispered, "This guy's toast," but Lewis's glare silenced him. "Admiral," Louis said, turning back to Edward, "I apologize on behalf of the department. This is not how we conduct ourselves." Edward nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I appreciate your apology, Sergeant, but words aren't enough. I expect this behavior to be addressed." "It will be," Lewis assured him, "and you'll be informed of every step we take." Edward gave a curt nod. "Fair enough. But if I may suggest something, perhaps consider equipping your officers with paint remover." Lewis allowed himself a brief chuckle, shaking his head. "He's going to need more than that." As Edward walked back to his car, George was escorted into one of the patrol vehicles, still muttering protests. The gathered crowd of onlookers, many of whom had been recording the scene, didn't hold back their reactions. Laughter, whistles, and sarcastic remarks filled the air. By the end of the week, George's fate was sealed. He was officially suspended without pay, pending further investigation. Meanwhile, Edward received a formal letter of apology from the department, along with a settlement as compensation for the incident. For George, the paint eventually washed off, but his reputation was permanently stained. Edward, on the other hand, drove off that evening with quiet satisfaction, knowing that justice had been served, with a vivid splash of red to make the lesson unforgettable.